put together by the German Museum of Humanities of Nature. So thank you so much for that. And so as you may see throughout my conversation, there is going to be some overlap with what you guys have already seen, already watched or heard from previous presenters, particularly, I guess, from the latest one that has put an emphasis on capital. But what I'm going to do also is try to bring in more examples, like more concrete examples of what does a successful model of community-based conservation look like, right? Community-based conservation model that really emphasizes puts an emphasis on local livelihoods, right? Rather than trying to transform their livelihoods, but already existing livelihood strategies, but also that puts an emphasis on cultural values that are already have a conservation ethos embedded in them. And I'm going to use example from my home country, Senegal in West Africa. But before that, I wanted to really set the stage. I think this is, it's no surprise to anyone, probably not in this audience, but to really hone in what exactly is causing a decline in biodiversity, right? I mean, the issues are complex, but I think we're so used, at least in the US particularly, I think there's a certain narrative that is often circulated about, poverty related types of ecological deterioration, or that attaching biodiversity decline and ecological deterioration on link it to poverty, particularly in Africa. But also link it up to things like poaching, for example, right? That the idea that poaching is really one of the main drivers of wildlife decline is quite pervasive, particularly in the US. But a look at the intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, their latest report, which was published, I think, in 2021, actually shows that global land use change that is resulting in agriculture expansion is actually one of the major causes of biodiversity decline. And in Africa, particularly, right now, there's such a big land rush among agribusinesses that are coming either from the US or from Europe, acquiring land and then transforming it for for commodities, the production of commodities for exports to the global north. In Senegal, the park where I did my work, the Biosphere Reserve, which is the Senegal River Transboundary Biosphere Reserve, which spans across Mauritania and Senegal, all around it, there are every year, every time I return since 2015, there's more and more new agribusinesses that are posting signs there. And most of the rice, the commodities that they're producing are rice, but also for biofuel as well. And so I wanted to really bring that attention to everyone, right? And it's always important to remind people here in the US and in Europe what exactly is driving global biodiversity loss in Africa. But of course, climate change is also causing an accelerating decline in the biodiversity gene pool. But what is specifically important here, of course, are the economic policies that subsidize these ecologically devastating policies in Africa, particularly. And those economic policies are not coming from African government, obviously, or if they are, it's probably because of austerity policies from the World Bank and the IMF. But economic subsidies by European governments, or governments in Europe and in the US that are subsidizing ecologically devastating policies to boost the economy. And so what is biodiversity conservation? Not that I need to go into details for that, but it's really the management and the protection, preservation of species and their natural habitat. And there have been over the years, since it started, two divergent conservation models, right? There's the indigenous model and there's what I call the Western model, which is really the dominant model. And most of you have already heard about it from previous speakers, right? But the indigenous model is really what we see is that humans are an extension of their natural environment, right? So things like protected areas are very foreign to most indigenous models. And if there are protected areas, it's what we call a social landscapes, right? A cultural landscape, meaning that cultural values are really always give primacy to the protection of those spaces. And I'll talk about it a little bit, what we mean by that, right? Like, what is a cultural landscape? And of course, from these two models, you have two divergent types of relationships around human nature, right? That in the indigenous model, there is no divide between human and nature, right? They're all one and the same. And so everything around the cultural values are set up to, in the way, protect the environment. But there's also the communal versus the private, which I'm glad that you guys talked about it a little bit on the last colloquium, right? Like communal land ownership versus private land ownership. And so the indigenous model of conservation is very much based on communal land ownership or land management systems versus the protected area model or the Western model of conservation, which is very much pushing a neoliberal type of model of privatizing parks or privatizing protected areas, or the idea that only finance capital can save or protect those areas. And so let's look at an indigenous model of conservation. And so I have to say, I am from Senegal. I'm Serer, right? My father is Serer, which is the third largest ethnic group in Senegal. And I will never ever forget that from the time I was young, it was one ethos that was instilled in me. It's the same ethos that's always instilled to people in the Serer region, which is that land is never owned, right? Land is never owned, but borrowed from the unborn. And so you must leave it for the unborn the same way that you have found it from your ancestors, or your ancestors have left it for you, right? So it doesn't matter, these types of beliefs still very much are ingrained in the ways in which the Serer people are managing their communal areas. Even if there's a private lease on that land, or when there's a deed on those lands, oftentimes it doesn't necessarily register among the people, right? Because this is something that this is their ways of life. This is a customary belief. And so oftentimes when you have the formalization process that must happen in terms of formalizing land ownership within those territories, it often doesn't articulate well with indigenous ways, with the Serer people ways of managing the land. And that happens often, right? Where the government says, try to formalize process of land ownership, but it doesn't trickle down or percolate to the among communities, because again, this is just very foreign to them. And so there are also an African ecocentric worldview, right? That the traditional beliefs and practices like taboos, ancestral myths, and rituals and fables, all of those ones are part of what we call our oral history, that is passed down from generation to generation around how to manage the land, but also how to care for wildlife. Totem is probably one of the most famous not famous, but most common and most well-known type of belief and ancestral myth that is still very much alive in many communities in Senegal, including my own. My last name is Sen. Sen in my language in Serer means the rabbit or the hare, right? And so because I am a Sen, my totem, my family totem is the rabbit or the hare, and so we have to care for those species, right? So each family has its own totem, and this is how, in the way, wildlife protection get passed down. And there's all kinds of stories and fables that go around the hare or even the python for those people, those families whose totem name are the python. And so I wanted to also give you, this is one of my, I did not take this picture. I'm not, all credit goes to an cultural anthropologist called Matar Noor, from Senegal. And he's taken a picture of the Jola men and boys standing in a sacred forest site in the protected forest of Casamance, in Senegal. So Casamance is the lower region of Senegal. It's probably one of the most biodiverse region in Senegal. And it's also a very important transition zone between the Sahel and Sahara region, which is much more arid and desertic, and the subtropics of West Africa. And so protection of those lands are absolutely critical. And so the Jola people are another ethnic group in Senegal who still have sacred forests and sacred mangroves that are very much tied to their traditional belief. Last time I visited a sacred forest, I was not allowed to go into that forest, right? The only people who are allowed to go into that forest are the initiated women and men and children. If you have not been initiated, then you are not allowed to go into those places. And they're also what we call, sacred mangroves. So the Jola people still have a very, very strong way of keeping on to their traditional beliefs, right? To maintain and to govern those spaces, those forests and those mangroves. The problem is that right now in Senegal, however, is that there is no legal recognition around customary governance or customary resource governance system, right? And so even though those forests have been protected by the Jola people, the government still has technically ownership. It's under national domain, and at any point, if there are private interest for it, and the government can make the case that this is actually for the public good, it can be taken away. And there is a lot of conversation right now that are percolating in that forest around carbon offsets. I actually recently got an email about 2 months ago about wanting to interview me about the forest there, because there's a great interest. Someone has put in a bid to put their forest under carbon market trading, and I had no idea. It really shook me. So I wanted to show you just an example of this beautiful work that NPR reporter has actually done. I will put the link here in the chat that you guys can take a look at on your own time. But she has done a beautiful, beautiful work at really collecting the stories of those people, of the Jola, not just the Jola, and the Jola are in the south of Senegal, but also in Guinea-Bissau. She's written beautifully about some of the stories, those myths, those taboos, those fables that I just mentioned, in keeping up with, maintaining some of this land in southern Senegal, but also in Guinea-Bissau. Of course, there's a threat of logging always. It's one of the largest threat, which is one of the pictures that she's showing. But also not just keeping up with the forest, but also even balancing their own fishing livelihoods with the ecologies of the rivers. And so, on your own time, you are more than welcome to take a look at it, but I just wanted to give you really a concrete example of what those traditional, those customary and traditional beliefs still work in Senegal to keep up with those forests or to protect that land. And so there is also, this is one of the sites that I have worked at last year it's a sacred mangrove in Casamance, Senegal, same in the same region. But even though they are sacred mangrove, this is not one of those actually, because the sacred mangroves are places where I was not allowed to go. But it's part of a co-managed protected area called Kalisai Ornithological Site. That place is actually co-managed by the people, the Jola of Caron and the Directorate of National Parks in Senegal. So this is one example of a great community-based, but also co-management approach. One thing that I need to emphasize is that there was no, the locals were not displaced. The indigenous Jola, from the indigenous people of that region, were not displaced from that place, from that protected area. As you can see, there's still people that are living in that island, right? But it's very closely monitored between the people, the residents there, and the Directorate of National Parks, which is part of the Ministry of Environment. And these, I think, if I can remember correctly, part of it was actually the Jola people have asked for a protected, the designation of a protected area. So it happens sometimes that it is the desire or the need to designate those areas as protected areas are actually coming from the indigenous people themselves when they see that there's a threat coming around them. So the African indigenous conservation model, what does that look like? We just talked about the co-management approaches. We also talked about, some of these taboos and rituals and systems that actually allows them to still continue to protect those places. But there's also the much more what I call technical aspect of it around their livelihoods, right? How do they balance their livelihood needs with the ecological integrity of those landscape? I mean, this is, no surprise to many people, but communal land grazing is probably one of the beacon of communal grazing systems that they have, especially among the Maasai people, but also not just the Maasai people, even in some areas of West Africa where you have the Fulani pastoralists who also have really adopted some of those models of seasonal movement of livestock that is based on the seasonal movement of wildlife as well, right? They are including the Somali pastoralists, right? Their land-based knowledge is what they use to guide the movement of their land, of their wildlife. In Senegal, the park where I worked at, the protected areas, is also very much a fishing area. And so there's a, seasonal fishing grounds of fishing movement that are rooted, that are based in the fluctuation, fishing resources. I mean, they understand how fisheries fluctuate, right? They understand the kind of the seasonality of those fisheries. And so they do practice, they have their own, livelihood practices that is very much based on those seasonal fluctuation, both of wildlife, but also of fisheries, that is very much embedded in their livelihood practices. The problem is that now there's this idea that any form of land-based extraction, that is, I would say, traditional from who they consider poor people, is always labeled as either poaching or something that is bad, or that it is just a unthoughtful, right? There's no thought process behind it, when that is not actually the case. And so I just wanted to give you a few examples, of course, of the traditional fishing fleet. As you can see here, it's in Senegal. These are very much, if you ever went to Senegal, you'll see plenty of this. This is part of really the landscape of Senegal, because fishing is such a strong part of who we are. But it is also very important to know that a lot of the fishing fleet, our fishing practices of the traditional fishermen there are actually very, very sensitive to the ecology of the oceans, but also of the river. All right, so that was really, when we talk about shifting ground from biodiversity to capital, right? a lot of these indigenous model, a lot of these community-based conservation practices are very much all about preserving the biodiversity, but also balancing that with their traditional livelihoods. But what is the state of biodiversity conservation in Africa? Is that Africa still supports 1/4 of the world, the world's most biodiverse area. Africa hosts the largest assemblages of megafauna, and 80% of the world's most biodiverse areas are in indigenous and Afro-descendants people. I was just telling Tahini earlier that I'm in South Carolina, and in South Carolina, there's a strong African-American presence there, especially on the coast of South Carolina. They're descendant, a lot of them are descendant of Sierra Leone and Guinea-Bissau and the south of Senegal, the Jola people. They're descendant of the Jola people, right? And they were actually taken from that land by enslavers, brought into South Carolina because the ecologies are very similar, but also because they have, because the ecologies of that region in West Africa is very similar, they have also kept up with their traditional ways of life as much as they could anyway, but also the African spiritual belief system. And so that land now in South Carolina that are owned by African Americans tend to be some of the most biodiverse in South Carolina, and they are currently also targeted for conservation easement. And so 80% of the world's most biodiverse area, part of it, and it is also an Afro-descendant, including in the US, Afro-descendant people. So lands where indigenous communities practice their customary governance system are some of the most biodiverse, and Africa has the highest proportion of indigenous people. So the Western model, right? I spent some time talking about, biodiversity centered kind of, indigenous model of conservation. Now this is the Western model of conservation, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I'm assuming that I think by now we're very much familiar with this. But I just found it very interesting that there are absolutely no humans in this, functional role, right? And this is really one of them. It comes from Trending Ecology and Evolution, which is one of the major conservation journals in the US, and it's quite troubling, right? But it's clearly here, there is absolutely, and if it's embedded in the Earth system, it's just very, very striking that there is absolutely no place for human in this vision at all. I should say, what kind of humans do they make space for, right? And so the Western model of conservation started in 1872 with the Yellowstone National Park, and this model where they have also dispossessed indigenous communities, right? Indigenous people. And so this same model was replicated throughout Africa with the first national park, which was Virunga National Park in 1925, and it was very much part of the colonial process. The Western model of conservation, again, where you have a mostly white, right, staff that is very, imposing themselves on the landscapes of Africa, but also you have wildlife on the side with no one in there, right? There's no people involved within, within those spaces. The idea that wildlife and people cannot cohabit is still very, very much a thing of, a paradigm that is ingrained in Western model of conservation, which is, to the detriment of Africans or agrarian Africans mostly. But I also wanted to bring you attention to even this whole language around, human wildlife conflicts, right? Everything, how was it created? No one really talks about it, but it's something that people have taken on, right? Western conservationists have taken on, and this has taken a life of its own, thinking about human wildlife conflict and how we frame it, and how, yet again, it further reinforces this antagonistic relationship between humans and nature and wildlife. So one thing that people often forget is even the proportion of protected areas, right? How most of it is really, 2/3 of protected areas are located in the global south, right? And that African countries like Namibia, the Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Zambia, and Guinea all have each set aside between 35 to 42% of their land for wildlife conservation. I mean, not just wildlife, but biodiversity conservation. The US only has 13%, right? The inventor of this fence and fines and forest conservation only has 13% of its land. Not that I'm advocating to expand protected areas or non-indigenous land, non-indigenous managed protected areas in the US, because the indigenous people of the US also have their active fight right now with the land back movement within the national park system itself, right? But I just wanted to bring attention to this stark disparity in the distribution of protected areas in the global South. But one thing that people also that is not often talked about is how protected areas is really reconfigures like colonial space, right? It completely erases indigenous speciality, but it also adds other borders, right, on top of colonial borders that have already rendered part of the global South extremely vulnerable to geopolitical insecurity. If you look at the Limpopo transboundary area in South Africa, between Mozambique and Southern Africa, there's already a lot of extrajudicial killings that are happening in that place, and the militarization of borders is also adding more fuel to that fire. And the same thing in West Africa right now in the Sahel. The Sahel, if you know anything about the Sahel region at this point, is that there's a lot of geopolitical instability happening in the Sahel region, but also those protected areas are now hotbeds for militant armed conflicts within those places because it's created this vacuum. But African Parks now is looking to expand, which makes no sense to me at all. Why are you expanding in an area that is conflict ridden, right? Like to expand in that place, but also further militarize those places as well in the Sahel region. And so what is really the motivation of even having African parks in that place? I don't think it's just purely for tourism or conservation. There are other reasons at play here. So from biodiversity to capital, Walter Rodney was a Pan-Africanist Marxist theorist who actually has written on the issue of protected areas in Africa in the 1970s. He said international imperialism was threatening to transform Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania into wildlife republics. Every effort was made to attract tourists to look at the animals, and the animals assumed priority is higher than human beings. Certainly tourism in all of its aspects is proving to be one of the new areas of expansion of the imperialist economy. It is a new way of confirming the dependence and subjugation of third world economies being seen in its most errant and vicious forms in the Caribbean territories. So he was not, I would say that, Rodney was not a conservation social scientist or neither a political ecologist, but he understood the role of protected area, the role of national parks within this expansion of economic imperialism by, European countries, but also the US, right? And sounded the alarm for it in 1972. And so what do we see today? This issue is actually unfolding on the ground, with especially with the recent eviction of the Maasai communities from the Ngorongoro region. But it's not just, the Maasai they're a classic case, but they're not unique throughout Africa. Pastoralists and fishermen and hunters are still being are sanctioned, are victim of state sanctioned violence, all in the name of conservation to put in conservation protected areas in those places. And so this is when we start to see clearly that the shift around conservation is moving from biodiversity to the reproduction of capital. And here we are in 2023 talking about the expansion of those wildlife republics, right? Where conservation NGOs, conservation is no longer led by indigenous communities, but by conservation NGOs who themselves are led by venture capitalists. It's also very much, the corporate capture of conservation in Africa. It's much more than anyone can ever grasp, right? And it's also really pushed by international tourism operators, but now also carbon offset markets. And also, there are also extractive concessions that are constantly given to extractive industries that are happening within the protected areas. In Senegal, as I was mentioning earlier, in that area, the Casamance region, where the Jola people are practicing the traditional belief system, is where Nyokolokoba National Park is also. After they have been displaced in the 70s, now the government is giving extra, has given private concession to mining industry in that area. And so it really gets you to think, what is really the function of protected areas now, if not for biodiversity? And so what are the alternatives today, right? I just talked about indigenous models of conservation, right? The shift from biodiversity to capital. And so what are the alternatives today for conservation that we can really aim for and push for? And I've written 2 papers around those issues that you can find on Google Scholar, not that I am putting a plug in for myself, but just really to highlight how conservation can happen without displacement. It can also happen by building onto those traditional livelihood practices that I talked about. And there's actually a model of it in Mauritania, a case study in Mauritania that I have written about on and now published in Environmental Development. So going along the same line, my research in West Africa is really looking at how can we recouple those nature and culture systems for conservation. And just again, another example here, this is the biosphere reserve that I was just talking about here, right around Djoudj. If you look at Djoudj National Park is where I spent most of my time. Djoudj and Joling. Joling is in Mauritania. And Djoudj is in Senegal. Right around here, there are so many agribusinesses that are expanding and are literally draining their pesticide in the park, in the waters. But these are places that are completely devoid of people, right? These are people, they're all displaced. Joling is very, very different. Joling National Park actually still has indigenous people living in those places, and they're working closely with the Directorate of the National Park in Mauritania on monitoring resource offtake by people by the locals, right? As particularly for fishing and farming and harvesting, right? So it's a very different model, and it's really interesting that they're sharing the same exact ecology, but also it's the same exact people. It's just that you have a colonial border here in between, but these people are exactly the same. They're both from the same ethnic group, but they have a very different models of governing those protected areas. And so recoupling nature culture system is really what Joling, that kind of vision, Joling National Park in Mauritania is also offering us. And so in conclusion, what is important, right, for even community-based conservation to work? What is important for recoupling those nature culture systems and completely getting rid of capital, not completely, but at least the destructive type of capital reproduction, is really to ensure that the land rights and the self-determination of those indigenous people are safeguarded, right? Because it is absolutely essential to save the world biodiversity. And so these models that I have given, from the sacred mangrove, the sacred forest, to the park in Mauritania, all of those places is where there is some, at least more than usual, some degree of sovereignty and self-determination by the indigenous communities. And that's it. Thank you.